Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm here today with Dr. Tom Bell, who's a family physician here to talk to us about cannabis and his clinical experiences.
Thank you very much, Elias. And thanks to the Schizophrenia Society for allowing me to be part of this really nice program. I'm really impressed with what's been done so far. So I'd like to take a couple of minutes to explain just kind of how a country semi-rural GP ends up on a podcast devoted to cannabis and psychosis. Let me just say, about 15 years before retiring, I got involved with our local Canadian mental health early psychosis intervention program. All through my practice, I was always committed to giving time to my patients who are suffering from mental health issues. So counseling or supportive psychotherapy on my own, but also utilizing community resources was very important. So I got to know people in the community. Our local hospital has a first-rate mental health care department and outpatient department, and so on. And so I was aware that the Canadian Mental Health Association had a branch office in Peterborough, and my involvement was in sitting, listening to parents talk about their experiences and their challenges with teens that developed psychosis. And it was a real eye-opener. It was very stressful for the families. Not to say that, and I've seen other segments of the podcast, I mean, it's not always this way. There's various presentations, but where we were in that space, these were people that were really quite stressed. And the other piece to this was, in listening to them, and this is about 15 years ago, the frequent referral or reference to using cannabis at the time the psychosis began. And this was something that was new to me. People viewing this podcast should know that there really was very, very limited training to family doctors on street drugs and recreational drugs. In fact, research, as you know, on this topic has lagged by a decade or so, and so we're in a big learning curve right now. But I put this in the back of my mind. I thought this can't be good. A few years later, I used to go to what we call grand rounds at our hospital. Dr. Peter Hughes, who is a pediatrician in Peterborough, gave a very good talk called Cannabis Coming to a Corner Near You. And this was a couple of years before the legislation was about to change for legalizing marijuana possession. It was a fascinating talk. It's a great talk that he gives. And in the course of that, he referred to evidence of THC actually altering cellular relationships in the developing brain and the neuron between neurons in the developing brain of individuals, of teens. And once again, I thought, oh, this is really quite interesting. And I ended up partnering with Peter. He gave and gives this talk all over central and eastern Ontario. But he and I and several other people in Peterborough started to give presentations to parent groups about just on information around what we were learning about cannabis in youth. And what came out of this for me was that parents, there were a number of parents who had significant knowledge gaps with respect to what cannabis is, how the impact is on the kids, what to say to their children, and so on. So there seemed to be a fair bit of anxiety about that. And I thought, well, I'm going to research this a bit more. And I began to look into it. And I found a few articles that referenced Dr. Suzanne Archie. So I got in contact with Suzanne, who has been really supportive in my quest, and made some good, told me about some good articles that I started to look into. The Center for Addiction and Mental Health Library people helped me, sent me some articles. And, you know, once you start reading articles, you start seeing references, you see the same names coming up, people who are involved. I filled up a whole book, a journal on some of the data. And I thought, I wonder if this could be translated into a book for parents. And so basically that's what I did in the end of my retirement, as I wrote this book. And you've allowed me to flog it so I can show it.
Yep, 100%.
There it is there.
Yeah.
It's Cannabis and Kids, a primer on pot for parents and caregivers. So it's evidence-based as much as I could, and it has been scrutinized by a few people in the mental health care field, and it's kind of been given a green light as current and topical and safe and respectful. And so this was kind of an exciting end to I guess to my career in a way, but I would want to make a statement, if you don't mind, and basically just want to say this journey has led me to conclude that parents play a significant role in the learning of their children about harm prevention and harms reduction related to exposure to cannabis, just like any other risks in growing up. And I think that I would like to encourage parents to seize the moment to learn about the topic and not to be afraid to open up the topic with their children. And so in that sense, I would like to share some of my experiences in prevention and just what I've learned from reading and writing this book that might be helpful to the parents.
Yeah, and thank you for all of that. It really gives context to how you ended up here and how you developed your expertise on this topic. Yeah. And I know you touched already on harm reduction, which is a big piece of our campaign here. Like what we're trying to accomplish is being able to reduce the harms associated with cannabis use, not necessarily like change the use itself, but change how people view their use, or change how people use in terms of like to cope or for fun, just to put it into a context that will be helpful in their lives as opposed to bring about harm. So that does kind of beg the question, what are some of the harms that people can experience from cannabis?
Well, there are some very well recognized harms. And I think I'd like to preface it by pointing out that people who are watching this program shouldn't have to panic over this. These are harms that have shown to occur in relation to the use of cannabis in some situations. And as has been alluded to in the past, the risks of harms are greater the younger the onset of use of exposure to cannabis is, the kind of cannabis or THC concentration that is being consumed, and the frequency. And I think there's a fourth piece that I think bears mentioning, is that also the role of synthetics, that it's so important that kids understand that to stay away from synthetics, because there's, that very important findings of real risks around that. But those other three risks increase the potential for harm. So in the mental health area, we know that psychosis can be brought out or triggered with exposure to cannabis in susceptible individuals. But in other areas of mental health, there are certainly risks associated with cannabis use, regular cannabis use, and depression in adolescents. And there's been some recent studies that I came across that really support that. And also worsening of anxiety. The impact, as from what I understand, the impact of cannabis immediately when you use it is a relief of anxiety and a kind of chill and a mellow, which is really very attractive. But if you're kind of struggling with anxiety, you may think, oh, this is pretty good. And then when it wears off, you're back to square one, and your brain kind of has to reorganize, and there it is again. And you then tend to use it again. And there's that self-medicating cycle that can occur. And so it definitely is associated with anxiety problems. Long-term use can be associated with, they call it amotivational disorders, social withdrawal. You can form a small network of users and peers, but that's your life kind of, and it can be a bit controlling, I think. Under the other area that is a risk is in cognition. And I think there's definitely some research that shows there's an impact on ability to learn and translate what you're hearing into meaningful memory and the ability to make appropriate conclusions about what you're supposed to be learning. So a 15-year-old who smokes up at lunch in high school, isn't going to be really learning maybe quite what they should in the afternoon. And that can result in a drop in academic performance. So these are all kinds of risks. I think there's another risk that bears mentioning, and that would be depression, or not depression, sorry, addiction. It's pretty well known that regular use, and I think we tend to think of regular use as about 3 times a week or more, can be associated with about a 16% risk of cannabis use disorder. That's about one person per 6. Whereas with adults, it's around 10%, it's about 1 in 10. And the other area that, of course, bears mentioning in terms of harms is the risk of accidents and so on with use. And the Mothers Against Drunk Driving and a number of other agencies, drugfreekidscanada.org, are engaged in really good media advertisements, urging people to have a care if they're high. I'll step out on a limb and I'll mention a very interesting study that was done. If you don't mind, you can always cut it if you run out of time. But in 1991, pilots were given a joint and smoked a standardized strength, and I can't remember what the strength was, but they had a joint, and then there were 9 of them, and they put these pilots into simulators to fly a plane and put them in at, I think, 2, 4, 8, 12, 24, and 48 hours. And 24 hours after they had a joint, the majority of them, I think maybe only one pilot thought he was a little bit buzzed yet, but the rest of them felt normal. But out of those 9, there were 7 pilots that failed the test, even though they felt pretty good. So it implies there may be some impairment in other brain structures like the cerebellum or something. It bears further study. It was only 9 pilots. But, when you read something like that, you go, oh, gee, we better watch out for this. So, yes, the message there, if anybody, is basically be very careful and give yourself lots of time after you've used. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the interesting piece about that study is these pilots are actually trained to fly. They're not just the average person trying to fly a plane. It's this is their job, this is their profession, and even that is impaired by smoking a joint 24 hours earlier. And I wanted to circle back to some of the harms and just talk about how it's probably not the experience of everyone that they experience all these harms, right? And certain people are more likely to experience certain harms, and there are people who are probably likely to experience none of them, right?
That's right. I had a great conversation with one young fellow. Everybody's younger than I am, but one at one of our presentations up in Halliburton, and he was very respectful and very articulate. He was kind of standing back and listening to us, and I could tell he was really thinking. He was kind of a skateboarder dude, and he had big hair, and he kind of took issue with what we were saying, because the reason being that he said, well, I use this. I've been using it for 2 or 3 years. And he said, I don't know what's the whole issue. I think if I remember correctly, maybe 2 or 3 times a week he used it. And so I listened to him. And as he talked, he mentioned that when exam time was coming close, he had to study. He would get off of using it. And he was able to take control of what he was doing. And he was obviously an individual who had a handle on it and wasn't suffering tolerance or getting into any other areas of concern. And I think, to your point, I think there are probably a lot of kids who thankfully are able to kind of keep on top of that. So yes, I hope I answered your question by that. But
yeah. Yeah, and I do have one more question about the harms that before we move forward. But from what I know, a lot of the studies are associative as well, right? So
Yes,
so like with depression or anxiety, for example, it could be that someone who is experiencing depression is more likely to use pot because they're experiencing like
that
the exactly, yeah,
exactly. That's
yeah.
right. The one study that may open my eyes, that may have changed that, is a Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA Psychiatry, and it was out. I referred to it in the book, and they looked at their cohorts were teens who used regularly versus teens that didn't use at all, and they had no pre-morbid. These weren't kids that were suffering from any pre-existent problems or family issues, and they were like age and sex match. It was a good study, and they found that the kids that were using cannabis regularly did have a significantly higher incidence of depression, and they concluded that it had to be not only an associative thing, but cause is a strange term, but it was a risk. There is
Hmm.
simply a higher risk if you're a well teen and you start using cannabis with regularity. You are at a higher risk of having depression. Doesn't mean for sure you're going to get it, but please be aware if things are seeming to go south and you're getting more withdrawn and sad or losing interest. Those are those kind of red flags that you need to be
Hmm.
aware of. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But overall, yeah, there's that associative element that people have to be aware of.
Hmm. And
Mm.
I think the idea of risk kind of ties us really well into the next point of like talking more about what parents can do, because parents can be a huge protective factor. And what you were
Yes.
talking about at the beginning there, where
Yes.
parents can play a huge role in like mitigating the harms that their kids experience from
Absolutely.
cannabis use or substances in general. So can you touch a bit more about that?
Sure, I'd love to do that, and that kind of leads into what our objectives were. But the again, what I learned from the journey in my book was that reading some studies that were surveys from teens. The teens value good information. They don't want to feel they're being manipulated around. They don't want to necessarily. I'm going to put it in my words. They don't want to adopt a parent's value system, like my value system. When I say don't do drugs, that's my value system. No, that's not really where they want to go. They want to know information so they can, I think, work it out and make good critical decisions. But they do value their parents' input. So that was very clear. And the other aspects of this survey showed that a lot of kids get their information from social media, the internet, and as you and I know, it's fraught with perils, distorted information, and so on. So this is an opportunity for parents to play a really good directive role in helping the kids access good information. So I think it's extremely important. And if I can share some of my thoughts about that, I would like to. Can I kind of go
Please.
down?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Well, the first piece, and this is what I did in I'll sort of compare it to what I did in practice. Pretty well every family doctor in Canada or anywhere every day is practicing some element of risk management or preventive medicine, and or harm prevention, harm reduction. It's all overlapping. And there are fundamentally two components that I referred to as, one is primary prevention and the second is secondary prevention. And I wondered as I was preparing for this blog segment, how did that relate to cannabis in kids? Primary prevention is where we try to reduce the likelihood of an event occurring. So I just realized a really good example is you've got a 2-year-old toddler, a niece coming to visit you, or a granddaughter, and you go around and put those plastic electrical outlet plugs in so they don't harm themselves. That is completely a primary prevention. You don't want to prevent them from hurting themselves, possibly getting electrocuted, but certainly suffering a bad burn. So that's primary prevention. Secondary prevention is the work and the strategy that we do to prevent somebody who already has a condition from experiencing the consequences of that condition. So I like the diabetes. When I cared for people with diabetes, I would use evidence-based guidelines to frame or to shape the care I gave. But the treatments were all based on what was shown to be of value. So the major risk of type 2 diabetes is stroke, heart attack, kidney failure, blindness, that sort of thing, vascular problems. So you worked with patients to initiate these strategies. But the really important thing about that was education and helping your patient understand why we're doing it. You know, it used to be when I started practice, take 2 of these every morning. Take 2 of the white pills every morning. You'll be just fine. You know, yes, doctor. Yes, you know. And that doesn't happen. No, that's what we do. So, but core to this is learning the topic. And so, if you're going to translate this to parents working with their kids for cannabis, the first thing parents really should do and make an effort is really get to understand what it's all about. Dispel your myths. I'll share you a little story. When I was 14, my mother said, "You'll like this, Tommy, don't ever accept a cigarette from somebody that you don't recognize from somebody you don't know." Oh, so if that meant if I didn't know you, but you came up and offered me a Camel cigarette, oh, I recognize that, it's safe. Or if I know you and you offered me a rolled up doobie, that's safe. So then I asked my mom, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "I'm talking about marijuana. You know, that's a drug that they take in the Middle East, and the assassins use it, and then they go out and kill people." And that was my introduction to marijuana. It got me interested. Here I am down the road. But you see, nobody knew much about it. There was all this myth built up around it. And so I think the basic piece here for parents is to understand what cannabis is about, its impact, what the risks are, and feel comfortable with that knowledge and confidence. So you have to be kind of confident if you're going to talk with kids, I think. I would like to mention MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Their websites will be very helpful. I really love drugfreekidscanada.org. Drugfreekidscanada. It's all one word. They have a Talking with Teens package it's superb. And you can also go online and actually talk to a teen actor volunteer and even rehearse some of the dialogue, because there's some words that they recommend that we avoid. Again, in the area of fear-mongering or using excessive words that may kind of turn their kids off a little bit. So I think that it's very important to have that knowledge base. There's another very good reference. It's called Canada's Lower Risk Cannabis Use Guidelines, and it's available through the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, camh.ca. I think if you just entered that term, cannabis lower risk use guidelines, I think you would get it as well. But that helps to set the stage, I think, to exactly to the points you're making, is that it's very appropriate and applicable. Mm-hmm. I in doing my prevention thing, I really have to make sure I knew what I was talking about, and that was our job, and that's Family Docs. We do that. Conversations, not confrontations, and that's something that a statement I dreamed up, but it's a conversation, and it's not. It shouldn't degenerate into an argument or anger or a fight or threats, or nobody should be upset over this. It's really an informative information thing that it's a dialogue you're having, and it may take time to open the door for some kids. They may not think that you're, as a parent, what do you know about it? Although I would insert here, it occurred to me that a lot of parents today are going to be 30 and 40-year-olds, and many will have had personal experiences, I think, with cannabis anyway, so they'll have their own, and many may not need an awful lot of coaching. They may be able to speak with experience, But I would recommend nonetheless that begin the dialogue early. It's important to start, I think, around grade 6. They use the phrase, the horse bolts from the barn, or that ship sailed a long time ago. It's potentially a good time to start with kids just inquiring about what they know about drug use, or do they have any friends that they know of people using drugs? What do they think about it? It's good to get, and the topic can be introduced not formally, but it can be around the supper table. One of my points was, I think it's really important to, if at all possible, to sit and have dinner together, if you can, as a family, to capitalize on these opportunities. I remember an interview with Kurt Browning's mother. Kurt Browning is a well-known, famous Canadian figure skater. And it was a long time ago, I think after the Olympics. And the interviewer was asking his mom about the long hours on the road with her son. I think Kurt lived in Alberta, if I'm not mistaken. And she said it was the best thing because she got to know her son and they had lots of time to talk. And this is that kind of thing I think we need to try to search for as parents. Another very important point, and in this is working with teachers. Now, I must say I didn't work with teachers that much in practice, but I'm trying to translate this into a value for parents. Most high schools and schools have home school associations or parents' councils. I think it's really important to find out what the curricula are and the schools your kids go to, and get to know your teachers, your kids' teachers, if possible. I'll take this opportunity to say that many school boards are developing curricula, and my niece, who is a teacher in the Toronto School Board region, was on a committee that developed their drug education curricula from grade 6 to grade 12. And what's really wonderful is, and she reassured me recently that this still applies, the Toronto District School Board they did a lot of work developing this curriculum, and they will share with other school boards or other school regions and districts what they've put together, saving a lot of time and expense. But I think that it's really important for parents to be involved with the school. I had a chat with a vice principal at one of our high schools in Peterborough, and the Parents Association is virtually non-existent. I found that really quite shocking. I like to think, as a father, I participated in it to some degree. Nothing like my wife did, mind you. And if my wife heard me say this, she would be saying, "Oh, you missed half of those, Tom. You were busy or you were doing something." But nonetheless, making an effort to know the teachers and what's going on at the school, I think, is very important. Make sure when you're talking with your child, much as what I would do with my patients, is that the language used is fairly straightforward and appropriate to their level of education or their age. And you can always check out with them, do they understand what you were kind of saying? Where are we in this conversation? Another option that I think might be worth exploring is sitting down with your teen or your child and looking at some websites on cannabis. The safe ones are pretty good, easy to identify. Often they're associated with, the Canadian Mental Health Association or Schizophrenia Society, things like that. I think, if you don't mind, I can kind of come to a close and deal with a little bit of the primary and secondary prevention, where that
Hmm.
is cannabis, because I didn't really. So primary prevention would be where you're sitting down with one of your children in grade 6 or 7 or 8, or one of the kids who's never, not using it, not experienced it, is cannabis naive, in other words, in terms of actual experience, and talking with them and having the discussion and seeing where they're at. So that's where the child is not using. Secondary prevention is, and so in that case, harm reduction would be, successful harm reduction would be if your child abstains or decides to delay use. If he's a 12 or 13-year-old and thinks about it and is able to go until they're 17, 18, or 19, that, to me, that's a success. That's good.
Yeah.
Or yeah, exactly. Or even if the child uses it a little bit earlier than that, but is only going to share a joint, or isn't going to use shatter or synthetics or something, then again, we've been successful. In the area of secondary prevention, that would be where, if by circumstance, the parent discovers that their child is already using, and it and wants to know, well, where do we go with that? Again, basic principles would be: don't panic, everything's okay. Your child is doing pretty good to hear, and so let's just begin from here. And it would be basically from a point of view, I think, of sharing your concern, that I'd like to hear more about it. How do you feel? Are you doing okay? I think a very important issue here is that somebody using cannabis, especially if it's being used fairly regularly, may be doing that for a reason. There may be some underlying emotional stressors or mental health stressors. I would throw up something like self-esteem issues, or maybe there's bullying going on, or online something or other, or so that if the response is to stress the risks around the cannabis use without looking at other parts of that child's existence, it may just simply add to the stress, or potentially, I think, could potentially distance your child from you. So it's a little bit more of a sensitive thing, but I like to think that it's still something that would be very doable, and that would be where Canada's lower risk guidelines would be really very helpful, and would be very helpful to provide or to go over with your team, and just really, again, hope for the best. Certainly, I don't think bringing up the topic is going to cause your teen to start using weed or anything like that. I think it's just all part of good communication.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my reading, it was kind of interesting. There was some comments. There's a book called The Pot Book that I forget the author's name, but there was a good segment on just these issues. And one of the comments was just keep life on a boil with your kids. Keep them active, encourage them to participate in sports or the arts, music, or set of drums, beat the devil out of a set of skins. Like that, that's also very important.
Yeah, and so I think that touches on the protective factors as well, like being able to have other things in their life and be able to support them in building like kind of a well-rounded life that it isn't solely focused on like substances or school or whatever it may be, just to be able to have a lot of things going on, and how parents can play a huge role in that. And it's a lot of information to dissect, but one thing that really stood out to me was the idea of collaboration, not confrontation, and the whole
Yes.
idea that it's not like a parent versus a child. It's like the parent and a child versus the harms.
Yeah.
So being able to work together to like have that communication and have those honest dialogues around like, okay, like this is what the substance is. This is where you're at right now, and these are like the potential harms. Like how can we form this relationship that you're developing with the substance to be the least harmful possible, or at least have the least amount of harms that you're comfortable with.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I thought of this analogy, and it's you're welcome to cut it out if you don't like it, but adolescence is like the Millennium Falcon going through the meteor, that meteor belt. He's being chased by, I think, the Empire and the TIE fighters. And, you know, and the Millennium Falcon is bouncing off of meteors and banging around, and I don't know why it doesn't get destroyed. But eventually it comes out at the other end, and then they go to warp speed, or, you know, boom, they're gone. And I think of my own teen years, and being an adolescent is kind of like that. And and I think a role of a parent might be just kind of to help, you know, figuratively speaking, help that Millennium Falcon kind of maneuver a little bit and help them get the tools to avoid those meteors and just cruise past until you come out at the other end and you have a better sense on things. Anyway, I just throw that out.
Yeah, and I think like kind of extending the metaphor, like it means it's okay to have a couple bumps and scrapes as long as the ship is still intact by the time you exit the meteor field. Then
yeah,
it's a win.
You're going. And you know the nice part, and I'm sure you could relate to this, is that when you come out through the meteor field and you look back when you were 14 or 15, you kind of go, "What was that all about?" You know, you're through it. You've moved through it, and so it's just getting there without getting hurt. Or it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, thinking back on my own experiences, like I don't understand like the motives of past me a lot of the time when I was like really into just substances in general and just not really paying too much attention to anything else. Like the mindset doesn't really resonate anymore because I had all those protective factors that I'm superbly like grateful for, and they helped me to kind of work through that meteor field, and kind of I was scraped up a little bit along the way, but made it through, and that's what's important.
Right. That's what's important. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And I wanted to also touch a bit on the prevention piece as well, because I think you dug into it a little bit, but I think we can touch on it once more before we wrapped up here. And I wanted to just tie together a few different things that you had said about primary prevention, because we talked about the secondary prevention and being able to help people through those bumps and scrapes. So with the primary prevention, like a big piece of that is that amazing information and that dialogue that people have, right? And while the lower risk guidelines can be used for like secondary prevention, but for the primary risk prevention, like how can someone frame a conversation with their kid to be able to like promote the best sort of like information? So is it literally just like sitting your kid down and being like, okay, like this is the facts as I know them, what do you think about it? Or how can you kind of structure that conversation?
I think that that's a very good question, and with and bearing in mind that I'm you know that I'm a GP and not a specialized in psychology but basically I think it's really a lot about opening the initial gambit, they call it, opening the door to a conversation. Like you know, I've been hearing a few things about cannabis use or marijuana use, and it's got me worried. Do you ever think about it, or have you thought about it, or do you have any questions? Because I've been reading about it and I've learned a lot of stuff about it, but I'd be really interested to know where you're at with this and what you think about it. And the initial responses might not be too expressive or voluble initially, but what you've done is opened the door, and the child knows it's safe to talk about that, and that it's not going to be an issue of discipline or you're grounded or anything like that. It's really more, this is life, and I'd like to know, you know, where you're at. I don't know if that answered that question.
Yeah, well, I think that opening of the door is
just
important.
Open the door.
Yeah.
You know? And you know, the context, I suppose, is really very important. you might, how can I say it? There's probably times to have that, open that door. You certainly wouldn't open the door when you're trying to help the child get ready to catch the bus or get ready to school, right? It's really more just if there's a quiet time and just set the time aside. And sometime you might say, well, I'd really love to hear more about it if you want to talk about it sometime, because I'm concerned about kids, or I'm concerned about what some of the effects of this are. I'm hearing that it might not be totally safe, or it might be some harm if you're not careful, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And then it opens up what you were talking about before about, like, if you have a family dinner, then that's like an avenue. If you have those long car rides, then that's an avenue. Just those being able to utilize those ideal times to
I think
have productive conversation.
I think so, Elias. And the other scenario could be you're at the table and maybe one of the other kids, maybe an older kid, starts to brings up about so-and-so was caught smoking a joint in the bathroom at the school or something. Oh, what do you think about that then? And then start the conversation. The conversation shouldn't be, what an idiot, blah, 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 pound the table and that sort of thing. But we really, that's interesting. Gee, does that person smoke it a lot? Or who's tried it? Have you tried it? So on and so forth, and they might deny it at first and then come back and, say, well, actually, I have tried it. They know that it's safe and they can have a conversation.
So maintaining that curiosity. So trying to like keep that door open through not like stigmatizing it, not making it taboo, but just kind of having an open mind and trying to figure out where they're at, trying to convey the information that you have and create some sort of middle ground where you can both feel comfortable with the potential for harms.
Sure. And, another point to that would be having an understanding that if either person is getting really uncomfortable with it, you could say to your son or daughter or your child, if I start to raise my voice, put your finger up and and I'll calm down, or vice versa. You can sort of indicate that so that things are kept on an even keel. Some little strategy like that might be helpful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Did you have any closing thoughts? Anything you wanted to say to kind of wrap it all up into a nice little bow?
Well, yeah, I think I would just summarize by saying that my conclusion is that parents have a really important role, as in so many ways, to play in helping safeguard their children and help their children make good decisions as they move through this learning period, and to not be afraid to open up these topics. You can also make it fun, and it can be a joint learning experience. And above all, have conversations, not confrontations, and be sure to listen carefully. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tom, for joining us. And I really appreciate your time, and thank you for being able to share all the wonderful information that you have.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's actually been fun.
I'm glad. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, that's good. All right. You take care.
Thanks, you too. And for everyone watching, thank you for joining us. And if you follow us on socials, thank you so much. And if you don't, then give us a look. We post some cool stuff.